The Battle of Gallipoli is one of the most famous battles in military history, with a disproportionate amount of books, TV shows, movies, documentaries, and articles written about it. It has been called a catastrophic failure by some and a brilliant victory by others. But to many people, the battle is largely unknown, even though over 250,000 soldiers from around the world lost their lives during the campaign. And at its core, the story of Gallipoli is a story of humanity. Soldiers on all sides fought with bravery and dignity, displaying great acts of valor and comradeship against a backdrop of unimaginable hardship, suffering, and death. This year marks the 108th anniversary of the battle, and for the first time, we're revealing the untold Ottoman perspective through a new series called Gallipoli Unveiled. This 4-part documentary will explore how the battle is remembered in Turkey, what stories have been passed down through generations of Turkish families, and how the events of 1915 continue to shape Turkish identity today. Join us as we unveil previously unexplored archive footage and photographs, bringing to life personal stories of courage and sacrifice that have never before been told in English. We'll take you into the battle-scarred landscapes of the Gallipoli Peninsula and explore sites of remembrance, paying tribute to the fallen. Episode 1 opens with the arrival of Allied troops at Cape Helles and the start of the Gallipoli campaign. The first landings of the British and French troops in the Gallipoli Peninsula are well known. On April 1915, two Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZ, forces landed at Cape Helles and on the nearby beaches of Bornu. This was done with the aim of capturing the narrowest point of the peninsula, which would allow Allied forces to threaten the Ottoman capital of Istanbul. However, within hours of landing, the Anzacets found themselves pinned down by well-positioned Ottoman forces under the command of Major General Mustafa Kemal, a decorated veteran of the Ottoman Empire's war against the Russians in the Caucasus. The Ottomans had anticipated a possible attack by the British and French forces and had prepared defensive positions in advance. As a result, the Allied troops were unable to achieve their objectives and suffered heavy casualties. Within days, thousands of men lay dead on the peninsula, making it clear that the battle for Gallipoli would be far more costly than originally anticipated. As the dust settled on the first day of fighting, an exhausted but defiant Mustafa Kemal surveyed the battlefield and turned to his staff, saying, "We are the heirs of the martyrs of the faith." In the following weeks, the Allies attempted to dislodge the entrenched Ottoman defenders, sending in reinforcements and launching major assaults on key positions. But despite superior numbers, they were unable to make any significant gains. As the summer wore on, the battle descended into a stalemate, with both sides digging into their trenches and hurling themselves into increasingly costly attacks. With supplies running low and casualties mounting, the Ottoman leadership faced growing pressure to produce results. Mustafa Kemal, determined to succeed against the odds, rallied his troops and planned a daring counterattack to drive the invaders from the peninsula. On August, Ottoman forces launched a surprise assault along the entire front line, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers and forcing them back from their trenches. The counterattack marked a turning point in the battle. While it failed to dislodge the entrenched enemy, it demonstrated the strength of the Ottoman forces. Sensing weakness among the Ottoman ranks, the commander of the British and French forces, Lieutenant General Sir Ian Hamilton, committed his last reserves to another major push, aiming to break the stalemate once and for all. By September, after a brutal 5-month campaign, the Ottoman defenses had been stretched to their limits, and although their numbers had dwindled to just 8,000, the Ottoman troops continued to resist fiercely. With the situation looking increasingly desperate, Mustafa Kemal received orders from Ottoman commanders to hold out for just one more week. But defying the order, he judged the situation to be hopeless and instead ordered his troops to withdraw from the peninsula. The sudden disappearance of Ottoman troops caught the Allied forces by surprise, and although they pursued the retreating army, they were unable to prevent the successful evacuation of the remaining Ottoman troops from the peninsula. With the departure of the Ottoman forces, the Allied forces occupied the abandoned fortifications and began to search for survivors. What they found shocked them. Entire areas of the peninsula, particularly those where the Ottomans had withdrawn, had been cleared of mines. Medical supplies, food, and water had been left behind, and the wounded were tended to with respect. The discovery of these acts of humanity led to an immediate ceasefire as the stunned Allied troops took a moment to pay tribute to their fallen enemies. The fighting had finally ended, but the battle for Gallipoli was not over yet. Over the next few weeks, the full extent of the devastation wrought by the campaign became clear. The Allies had suffered nearly 235,000 casualties, of whom 46,000 had been taken prisoner. Despite having fewer than 20,000 troops at the start of the battle, they managed to inflict serious casualties on their attackers. In total, some 70,000 Ottomans lost their lives during the battle. For the Ottomans, the victory at Gallipoli was a source of national pride and remains an important part of Turkish identity to this day. But it came at a tremendous cost, and the impact of which is still felt today. At the end of World War I, Mustafa Kemal would lead the Turkish War of Independence against the crumbling Ottoman Empire. He would defeat the British at places like Sakarya and help establish modern Turkey in its place. But what if I told you he wasn't alone? What if I told you that one man who aided his victory was none other than Winston Churchill himself? Now, the story everyone knows about Gallipoli is one of humiliation for the British Empire. In 1915, they attempted to capture the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, then known as Istanbul. With a surprise attack through the narrow straits of the Dardanelles, the goal was to force the Ottomans out of World War I on the side of the Central Powers and open up a supply line to Russia. It ended up being an unmitigated disaster, as the ill-prepared British and French troops were mowed down by entrenched Ottoman soldiers. After 8 months, the Allies retreated, having suffered over 200,000 casualties for absolutely nothing. But this version of events is from the perspective of the victors, and today we are going to look at the conflict from the perspective of the Ottomans and uncover some forgotten details along the way. The first thing to remember about the Ottoman Empire in World War I is that it was already dead on arrival. At the start of the war, the once great power had become little more than a European backwater. Its population was fragmented into competing ethnicities, and its army was woefully outdated. When the Russians invaded the Ottoman Peninsula in the Black Sea, the Grand Vizier, the equivalent of the Prime Minister, wanted to make peace immediately. But the Sultan, the last of the Ottoman sultans, wanted to hold out until the Germans came to save them. The Germans did come, and they offered the Ottomans the chance to join the Central Powers. However, they only did so under the condition that the Ottomans would also have to wage war against their Russian and British subjects. So really, the only reason the Ottomans joined the Central Powers was to fend off the Russians. So when the British came to the Dardanelles, the Ottomans knew there was only one outcome possible. They would either have to win a stunning victory to drive the British out, or slowly lose territory, until the Germans came to finish the job. This is why the Ottomans fought so hard at Gallipoli. They needed a miracle. The Ottoman forces that defended the peninsula were led by a German staff and consisted of fewer than 40,000 men. Half of these were conscripted peasants with almost no training, while the other half were veteran troops that had been fighting alongside the Germans since the beginning of the war. These men all fought with incredible bravery and determination, not just because of the poor treatment they received from their own government, but because they knew their homeland was in mortal danger. In addition to the manpower, the Ottoman defenders also had superior firepower and artillery. For the British, the situation was dire. Having underestimated the enemy, they found themselves facing well-entrenched Ottoman soldiers with rifles that shot just as straight as theirs. Add to that heavy artillery, and the British were completely stuck. Any attempt to move across the open terrain was met with deadly volleys of bullets and shells. With each day, more and more British soldiers fell victim to these defenses. To alleviate this problem, the British launched a massive naval bombardment of Ottoman positions. However, this proved to be ineffective. While it did inflict casualties, it never broke the Ottoman lines. What really caused the British to lose was the steadfast defense of the key Ottoman fortresses. You see, in order to advance inland, the British needed to capture two critical fortresses: the forts of Cumkale and the forts of Settle Bear. For 9 months, the British launched repeated assaults on these forts, but each time they failed. One reason for the failure was that the British commanders misjudged their enemy. British intelligence believed the Ottoman defenders were low on ammunition and supplies. As such, they believed the Ottomans would eventually crack and collapse. Instead, the Ottoman defenders held out longer than anyone expected. The British commanders never realized that the Ottomans were receiving regular resupply runs by sea and rail. Every few days, new shipments of food and ammo arrived at the forts. which kept the men supplied for the entire 8-month siege. The Ottoman soldiers were so well supplied that when the British finally captured one of the forts, they found fully stocked warehouses inside. In addition to the British failing to account for reinforcements and supplies, they also failed to consider the manpower available to the Ottoman Empire. There was no shortage of recruits to replace the men lost in battle. Remember, this was a nation where every single able-bodied man was conscripted into the army. Even though many Ottoman soldiers died heroically in battle, their sacrifice was not in vain. If the British had managed to breach the Ottoman trenches at any point during the conflict, it is likely the entire nation would have collapsed. Instead, the Ottoman soldiers held out long enough for the Germans to come to their rescue. Had the British taken Constantinople, it is unlikely the Ottoman army could have held out much longer without collapsing into total disarray. As it was, the Germans coming to the rescue of the Ottomans would be a trend in the war. At Gallipoli, the Germans sent reinforcements and supplies to keep the Ottomans in the fight. Later in the war, the Germans would even send troops to help defend the rest of the Ottoman Empire from the Russians. Had the Ottomans lost Gallipoli, it is possible that the Germans wouldn't have bothered coming to their rescue. Why waste precious German troops on an Ottoman army that couldn't even defend its own capital? If the Ottomans had lost, there is a good chance that the Arab nations, including those aligned with the Central Powers, would have declared independence and the Ottoman Empire would have ceased to exist. But at Gallipoli, the Ottoman soldiers didn't just hold out long enough for the Germans to come to their rescue, they outright won against the British. From April to January, the Ottomans inflicted around 220,000 casualties on the British and French. The Ottomans also destroyed over 200 British and French ships. The Ottomans loved this battle so much that they commemorated it with a postage stamp. This was a rare occurrence at the time. Normally, the Ottoman government avoided commemorating battles in which they took heavy casualties, but the propaganda value of this victory was too high to ignore. By January, the British had lost faith in their generalship and logistics. The Ottoman soldiers were running low on supplies, and the political situation at home was becoming increasingly unstable. Realizing the jig was up, the British and French decided to retreat from the Dardanelles. In hindsight, the decision to invade the Dardanelles was a terrible one. The British lost 200,000 men for nothing. And even then, the number of casualties for the Ottomans is disputed. And now we need to talk about how the Ottomans lost the rest of the war. In my opinion, it was this victory that kept the Ottoman Empire alive for another 3 years. Without it, I doubt the Germans would have come to their aid against the Russians. And without those German troops, the Arabs would have risen in revolt, and the Ottoman Empire would have dissolved into a dozen independent states. Instead, the Germans came to the Ottomans' aid and even gave them large amounts of money to improve their military. However, the German aid was never enough to stop the collapse of the Ottoman military. It's important to remember that the Ottoman military peaked at around 800,000 soldiers during World War I. This may sound impressive, but that was almost entirely made up of untested conscripts. The vast majority of these men saw no action. In fact, only around 200,000 ever saw combat. Of that number, less than 40,000 were veterans. So even with the aid of the Germans, the Ottomans just didn't have the trained personnel to wage war on multiple fronts. On top of this, the Ottoman government was incompetent and corrupt. The constant infighting between the pro-German and pro-British factions meant that no one was looking out for the good of the empire. Also, the Ottoman economy was in sharp decline throughout the war. Despite getting aid from Germany, the Ottomans never really recovered from the economic impact of the First Balkan War. This greatly limited their ability to wage war. To add insult to injury, the Ottoman government took loans from both sides, meaning they had to send diplomats to both Germany and Britain. Just imagine trying to balance those two during World War I. No wonder they were so corrupt. Despite all this, the Ottomans nearly pulled off another upset against the British in the Middle East. The British commander in Mesopotamia, General Townshend, wanted to capture Baghdad, the seat of the Ottoman government in Iraq. Townshend thought his 15,000 British soldiers were strong enough to do this, but he vastly underestimated the capabilities of the Ottoman defenders. The British quickly found themselves pushed back towards the Persian Gulf. At one point, only 2,000 British soldiers remained. Townshend surrendered, and with that, the British lost control of Mesopotamia. But just like at Gallipoli, the British would have another chance to redeem themselves. In the aftermath of the Battle of Baghdad, the Ottoman Empire tried to launch a counterattack. However, They had severely depleted their resources and were unable to mount any serious resistance. A British force of 12,000 men soon pushed them back. In the north, the British and the Ottomans would fight for control of the region for another year, but the outcome was never in doubt. By 1918, the Ottoman forces in the Middle East numbered around 40,000, while the British had more than double that. And with that, the Ottoman Middle Eastern campaign was effectively over. With Gallipoli and Mesopotamia effectively over, the only Ottoman forces left in the field were those defending the Syrian front against the British and those in Palestine against the Australians and New Zealanders. And with that, the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire was finished. I hope you enjoyed learning about this lesser-known chapter of Ottoman history. Don't forget to like the video. Thanks for watching.